saying maybe we should bomb Iran or fight a war there. Again, for states thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons or giving them up, how do they see this, and what is the incentive there when they hear that kind of rhetoric? Thanks.
Sure. So does anybody want to take that?
I got a couple. Well, first of all, congratulations on being at such a great school. But why don't we go to the other? I didn't want to cut you off. Go start. All right. I think one thing on inspectors to keep in mind, and I'm not an expert on all of these negotiations, but my experience in this is that transparency along the lines of what we got through the JCPOA, which is the most intrusive verification procedure ever negotiated, put aside the total surrender of Saddam Hussein after the Gulf War. There's nothing else that's been amicably negotiated that's nearly this intrusive. This type of transparency is a huge imposition on a country's traditional notion of sovereignty, and is therefore, I'm glad that we got it, but it's therefore a huge political burden for them. It's really hard to get countries to agree to this type of transparency. And so having gotten them to agree to then pull the rug out from under them, it's going to make it harder. It's going to make it harder for us to ever renegotiate an agreement with this same regime, let alone to negotiate anything with the likes of the North Koreans or others. And on the last question, just look at the broad picture that this administration is painting, okay? You have a president who is pulling out the rug of diplomacy on North Korea, saying, don't waste your time, Rex, is saying that there's a military option when everybody who has ever looked at that option, previously in government or current, says it's a terrible option that could cost hundreds of thousands of people their lives, but apparently that's the preferred option. A president who's taunting regimes by going personalistically after their leaders, suggesting that it's a mano-a-mano contest, me or you, win or lose. You start to strip away every other option but war. And that is a recipe for war or serious miscalculations. And that's just on the North Korea issue. If you throw in the Iran issue, where not only through tweets but through actions, we've stepped away concretely from the most, the best arms control agreement or non-proliferation agreement of this type that we've had in recent decades, why would the North Koreans ever agree to negotiate? They won't, which means there's only two options left. Permanently living with their nuclear capacity, even though the State Department says we won't accept their nuclear capacity, which they already have, or going to war with North Korea. Do those sound good to you? General Dunford doesn't believe they sound good, which is why he said we should stay with the Iran deal.
So there are greater experts in this field than me in the room, but I would also say you need to look at the consequences for the NPT as a whole, which has been an absolutely core tenet of the modern era of international security. If you start picking away at, I don't believe the IAEA inspections, they're rubbish. Or you can think of a million other ways in which, there are serious consequences for big picture issues here, which don't only apply to Iran, but they apply to that international kind of order that we have built around counter-proliferation, non-proliferation. So those are concerning issues too.
So another.
I'd add just one quick point, if it's all right. And there's a couple case studies that are swimming in my mind based on your question, which are Iraq, Libya, and Syria. So all places that have had an interest over the years in nuclear weapons capability. So the Iraq angle, we sort of know how that one got dealt with. The Libya angle, right, where they had given up, we sort of saw how that got dealt with, and I think there was a lesson internalized by a bunch of regimes on that. And then there was Syria, where there was the covert nuclear reactor that the Israelis destroyed in September 2007. So these are all kind of painting certain pathways. This deal allows for a little bit of a different pathway vis-a-vis Iran. And frankly, it's a pathway that I think is probably more in U.S. national security interest than, say, having to go in and invade, for example, if you look at a case, the case of Iraq, or having to use military force if you look at the case of Syria. And so to the extent you can make this work and incentivize that pathway, that's actually a really good thing, I think, in long-term U.S. and probably European national security interest. But to the extent it gets pulled back in that it is shown, hey, you can pursue this path, but not for very long because we're just going to pull the rug out, well, I don't know why other countries might be interested in it then.
All right, well, we'll take a couple of questions over here and then back over here behind. So, yes, there first.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, thank you for speaking on this panel and organizing it. My name is Namrata, and I'm a Scoville Fellow in the Peace and Security Department at Rethink Media. Dr. Carlin, earlier you spoke to ways in which we can crack down on the Iranian regime's bad behavior by monitoring the Hezbollah weapons trade and monitoring Iranian involvement in Syria. So my question kind of has two parts. The first part is, which party outside of the U.S. and maybe outside of Israel do you think might have the most sway over Israeli politicians like Netanyahu and Lieberman in slowly helping convince them to publicly admit that there are ways to address Israel's non-nuclear security concerns with Iran without necessitating the breakdown of the JCPOA? And the second part of my question is, if there are parties that you think might be able to do this, what are the strongest arguments that they might use?
So let's take one more question, which was right behind over here. Thanks.
Hi, Laura Holgate, former U.S. Ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency. You asked a great question of the day after with President Trump, with a European. What about the day after? What does Iran do? And what does Russia do? And in particular, at the UN. I was struck by Richard Nephew's comment in the previous thing that it would take Iran becoming in material breach of the underlying UNSCR to trigger action there. But why wouldn't Russia, or Russia on Iran's behalf, bring our behavior up as a violation using the dispute resolution structures within either the JCPOA or the UNSCR?
Great. So we have two good questions there. I think one was definitely for Mara, so you can start there. And I don't know if the second question is better for Colin, unless our European colleagues want to comment.
Russia's closer to Europe.
Yeah, so they want to. It's
a Georgetown professor who knows geography.
I can't see it from my house.
But if you, actually, yes, if you,
When you're in
okay,
California,
if
it
you do
might
have.
All right. So the way I understand your question is effectively kind of who is able to convince the Israeli kind of political elites that it makes sense to stay in this deal, and that worrying about Iranian sort of proxy behavior, I use that a little bit of loosely, and also its kind of conventional weapons should be higher on the priority list. So per my earlier comment, right, there's politics and there's policy wonks. So I don't know that any of us have great advice on how to deal with politicians. That's just, they're seeing the world through a little bit of a different aperture. I'd like to think the best folks to convince them are the people sitting like in the Kiryat in Israel, in Tel Aviv, who are able to talk about what the security environment looks like today and the trajectory that it's on over these coming years. So when you look at sort of Iran's growing missile capability, that's worrisome. Much higher on the list, if I'm sitting, say, in Tel Aviv, for example, though, would be the type of material that's getting transferred to Hezbollah. And frankly, even higher than that is all of this great kind of practice that Hezbollah is getting, whether it's coalescing different groups and sort of proxy-type militias, training and equipping them, whether it's learning kind of how to project power throughout places like Syria and kind of beyond. So I think what I would want to do is I'd want folks who are able to wear a security hat in Israel to try to explain why it makes sense for this nuclear piece to be closely monitored, for it to be very high on the worry list of folks sitting in places like Berlin and London and Paris, and for the Israeli kind of militarily political elite to be thinking about some of the much closer problems. So what do you do if it is in fact true that, say, Iran is building missile factories in Lebanon? So if Iran, the border it is effectively purchased with Lebanon is looking increasingly worrisome when you are standing in Israel. That needs to be kind of the near-term immediate challenge, and to the extent other places are worried about these bigger issues, that's probably a good thing.
So actually, I'm going to intervene for 1/2 second on this because it's such an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Just to add that, I think, Mara, I totally agree with you. It's the security establishment in Israel that really needs to make the case. Traditionally, the only foreign interlocutors they'll listen to, like very convincingly, who have the most credibility with them, is the American security establishment and the role that we can play in at least engaging with them, which I still think happens. Even if you have an administration, it's in a slightly bit of a different place. But Klaus, I think, or Samantha, if you wanted to address the second question about isolation of the United States and the UN Security Council and also the Russian response in the event of something like this?
Yeah, in the event that there would be the nuclear sanctions would be reimposed by the U.S. So the beauty of this deal would fall apart, where you had not only the EU and the US together, but also Russia and China on board, sign up to this deal with Iran to eliminate the nuclear weapon threat, would fall apart. We have achieved over the past years between the US and Europe unity on the sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. Now, if the EU and the US were divided over the Iran deal, of course that would be something that Russia would love to exploit. Wonderful. I already hear the champagne corks popping in Moscow. I mean, could there be any greater gift to Russia than having a serious confrontation about the consequences of the Iranian position of nuclear-related sanctions between the US and EU? I don't think so. So this issue, Iran sanctions, is not happening in a strategic void or in a bubble. It's in a larger strategic, global strategic context, and we also keep that in our minds.
Just one quick thing to pile up on that, because when I worked for Vice President Biden, we spent a huge amount of our time on the Russia-Ukraine issue and trying to make sure we were all on the same side in those Russia sanctions. And obviously, the Russians don't like being targeted with secondary sanctions, and they would benefit greatly from an international conflict between us and the Europeans that called into question the legitimacy in general of U.S. secondary sanctions. That is, countries don't like our secondary sanctions, no matter what it is, but they stomach it when there's a political objective in common, such as Iran prior to the JCPOA and after Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and what they've been doing in the Donbass. That starts to go away if the United States looks like willy-nilly on a whim based on no evidence other than the president hating something that will basically put at risk billions and billions of dollars in other people's countries and their companies. And I will tell you, and maybe Samantha or Klaus could be more specific, but there are a lot of European countries that would just as soon not go along with the Ukraine's Russia sanctions. They want to go back to business as usual with Russia, and we don't want to give them an excuse to do it either. So, in general, I think it's a bad thing to give Vladimir Putin the moral high ground on anything, and to the degree that this gives him yet another way to poke us in the eye on sanctions more generally, it's dumb.
Let's take a couple more questions over there.
Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. Great panel. So the point I was going to make was we talk about the deal in 10 years from now, and people don't often think about the fact that 2/3 of the population is under 35. They want to be part of the world. They're entrepreneurs. That they're they're getting Airbus. They're traveling, and that the last few elections there were more moderates elected. But then, like, what strikes me in this panel, everything that everyone's saying is so rational. And what we're really dealing with is the dominance of the irrational. I mean, we all know this. I'm not saying anything new, but it's just there's a phenomenon known as negativity dominance. So it's sort of like nothing rational, that it's like pure compulsion to undo Obama and hate and all of this. So just our strategy, we need to deal with the irrationality of overpowering irrationality.
Do we have another question up here in the front?
Doug Samuelson, Infologics Incorporated, Annandale. It seems to me that the biggest threat from a rogue state program like Iran's or North Korea's is not where they might use it, but where they might sell it. And perhaps we need to look more closely at the implications there if the deal were to fall apart.
So we have a couple of questions on what happens to Iran's nuclear material afterwards, and more more broadly on sort of illogical foreign policy, which I think is a tough one to answer. And then maybe I'd throw an additional one into the mix, because I think, just going back to something that Ambassador Holgate said, which was, and we talked about the Russian angle, but the other part of that question was, how does Iran react? Which I don't think, we don't really have we don't have an Iranian on the panel. But if folks who've looked at this, how does Iran react in the scenario of decertification, I think is also an interesting one to, or reimposition of sanctions is an interesting one to walk through. So maybe what we can do is actually let folks sort of go down the line and both address those questions, but also use it as an opportunity to say anything else that they want to say, because I think this will sort of be our last round of questions. So as your sort of final word also, and anything else that you want to communicate to this audience that we should all think about after spending 2.5 hours sort of mulling through this possibility.
Well, thank you so much, Ilan. Just very briefly, 2 points perhaps. The one is, yes, I think there is a strong irrational component in this debate, even more reason to keep a cool head, frankly, and analyze the situation as it is, and not go with false narratives and simple solutions that can lead us into very negative situations. And yes, I agree. There is a real risk of proliferation of technology if we rock this boat, which is currently a very delicate balance.
Thank you. How does Iran react? Wouldn't they love to have the high ground? Wouldn't it be great if the deal fell apart and it was someone else's fault, not their fault? I can see this might suit some, not all, voices in Iran. Other reflections, I think we have touched on, the issues of the sunset clauses and the successor, and Colin made some great points about you need to be ready to have that conversation, you need to have something to bring as well as something to ask for. But it's maybe just worth mentioning that this is the most intrusive verification inspection process. It's also perfectly normal in an arms control deal for it to require a successor. So there's sometimes hear these voices about it wasn't perfect the first time. There is no other treaty out there to which that would apply. So it is entirely within the bounds of what the kind of international community expects, and absolutely ready to have that conversation at the right moment about what happens and what to look afterwards. But as my sort of final thought, coming back to where Mara started this afternoon, is if we didn't have the JCPOA in place, we would not be having conversations about how to push back Iran in Yemen, or how to tackle specific micro issues, which we do want to tackle. But we have the space and the time and the policy bandwidth, to use the geeky term, to do those things because we are not stressing about the nuclear program right now. And if we didn't have the deal and the program were going full steam ahead, we wouldn't be having these other conversations. So we really do think that we want to have those conversations, we want to be tackling those problems, but let's leave the deal where it is, keep working on it, keep talking about its future, but give ourselves the space to do the other things we want to do.
I'd say your point is spot on. I mean, when any of us thought about what a nuclear weapons capable Iran would be, some folks worried about use, but I think for a lot of us, the much higher concerns were proliferation. I mean, thank you, Pakistan. We've seen all sorts of great case studies on that front. And then also, the followers, right? So those around the region, and I think for folks who are smart on Asia, they see this obviously in the North Korea context. For those who are around the region looking at what's happening, who may or may not have as much faith in, say, Washington to sort of respond in certain ways, what do they choose to do, and what path do they take? And those are pretty ugly scenarios, and I'd rather not have to weigh those if we don't have to, right? It becomes a little bit of a debate between murder and suicide. So more broadly, what I would say is, as we're kind of looking across this landscape, it would be nice if we could have a sort of strategic approach to Iran, informed by the deal, right, cognizant of it, but really looking across sort of all elements of the challenges that it poses. As you look at these next few years, we've been given a little bit of a gift of time. Obviously, one is monitoring, one is working closely with allies, et cetera, but this is an opportunity to deal with some really, really problematic elements of Iran's behavior.
Great. Well, thanks, Ilan. Thanks, CNAS, for having us all. It's been great to be up here with you all. Diane, I wanted to say a little something about what you said. I hope that you're right about demographic changes in Iran creating more moderation over time. It's completely possible. It's also possible this regime hangs on in one form or another. I think that there's a lot of myths that go around about the deal, and one of them was that the Obama administration banked on the deal itself producing moderation in Iran. I think the more accurate statement is that we all hoped that it would buy time to see if and test whether Iran was willing to become more moderate, and we don't know yet. It hasn't worked so far, but the president was pretty clear that the deal made sense even if the regime didn't change. In fact, it made more sense because the last thing you would want to do is to arm this regime with nuclear weapons, right? So buy some time to prevent that from happening. I can remember one of my best friends in the Israeli Defense Forces was a guy named Amir Eshel. He just stepped down as the chief of staff of the Israeli Air Force. Have you ever seen the picture of the 3 Israeli F-15s flying over Auschwitz? He was flying the lead F-15, all right? No Dove on the Iran issue was in charge of the war plan for Iran and Israel. And I remember my conversations with him in the 2009 timeframe where Amir would say, can you imagine if we had to fight the 2006 Lebanon war with the shadow of a nuclear Iran in the background? Can you imagine how much greater of an existential challenge that would be to Israel? And he's right. And they don't have to deal with that issue right now. So as troubling as Hezbollah is, the alternative of a nuclear-armed Iran backing Hezbollah is exponentially worse for Israel, which is why the majority of Israel's defense and intelligence community don't agree with Bibi Netanyahu and continue not to. And they held back the Israeli leadership from launching a war against Iran in 2009 to 2012 to take out the nuclear program. And I suspect they're making similar arguments on the inside now. But that hasn't stopped Netanyahu himself from, telling Trump either nix it or fix it on the Iran deal, which is what Netanyahu said at the UN. In terms of the irrationalism that pervades part of this debate, my only advice is you're not going to solve the irrationalism at the very top. You're just not. No, I'm not being flip. It's not going to be solved until the next election. But the adults can hold the line. And when Mattis went to Jordan and told the troops that they had to hold the line, they all have to hold the line against us doing stuff that is catastrophically bad for our national interests. So I think that's probably why they're trying to give the president an option to decertify so he can kind of get it off his chest and then hold the line. It's a terrible, unnecessary, risky gambit. But, such it is what it is. And Congress needs to do their job. If the president doesn't do the right thing, then Congress needs to do the right thing. Doug, on the point about whether Iran could become the next AQ Khan, become a proliferator for others if the deal falls apart, people should keep in mind both the procurement channel and the intrusive inspections of not only Iran's nuclear facilities but the entire supply chain gives us so much more visibility into what Iran may or may not be doing, not only in terms of their own program, but with others. Why would we give that up? I can tell you nobody in the intelligence community wants to give that up, right? Nobody in Israel wants to, nobody in the Israeli intelligence establishment wants to give that up. The last point on how Iran would react, and I'm sorry for talking so long, I think both Salehi, who is their lead nuclear negotiator, and Rouhani have essentially said that if Europe and the Chinese and the Russians stay in the deal and Trump exits it, Iran will stay with the deal, largely for the reasons that have already been mentioned, which is because it's a huge gift to the Iranians. They get to drive a wedge between us and our closest allies, and that reduces the pressure on Iran. It doesn't increase the pressure on Iran. It's tailor-made for us to have less consensus to address the rest of Iran's troubling behavior. It's nuts. It's literally nuts. All right? And yet it appears to be the theory of the case. So they would love it. I think over time, if the U.S. did reimpose secondary sanctions and it really started to hurt Iran, They would use it as an excuse to back away from their nuclear obligations and resume their nuclear progress, but with a catch. They would do it with the sympathy of the world, because we started it. That's a terrible outcome. Either one of those outcomes, where in the best case the deal is intact, but we're isolated, not Iran. Worst case, the deal is shredded, and Iran gets to play the victim even as they resume their nuclear progress. It's nuts. So our goal should not be to be nuts, but to stabilize the deal, build on it, have a mature adult conversation, and thank God we have a decade to figure it out.
Well, with that happy note, no, I'll close on a I'll actually close on a slightly more depressing note than Colin, which is just to say this question of irrationalism. We seem to be attributing it to some of the decisions that might be made by this administration or by this president if he chooses to not certify. But then we're also spending a lot of time projecting how other actors will react totally rationally in response. But the real risk is that they don't react rationally in response and things go even worse. I can imagine a scenario, the only thing worse than Iran reacting rationally and trying to stay in the agreement might be Iran dramatically accelerating its nuclear program, because then you can imagine a whole series of irrational responses on all sides. And so I think I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for all these discussions. We'll continue to watch this issue closely. Liz and I will be doing various podcasts, writing, and others, and a lot of our colleagues up here and also the colleagues who were in the first session have written a lot on this already, and I think continue to watch those people because I think there's unfortunately probably going to be a lot to write about in the next few weeks and comment on. So thank you very much for joining us, and if we can, just a moment to give a hand to our panelists. Thank you.